Hello everyone, and welcome to this quick start tutorial for Redshift and Cinema 4D. In this video, we're going to be covering the basics of creating materials and applying these materials to objects in your scene using Redshift. This video does presume that you have at least some basic working knowledge of Cinema 4D and 3D software in general, including some of the basic concepts of shading and lighting. Also, this assumes that you have at least some basic working knowledge, even if just entry level, of Redshift, including how to add Redshift lights to a scene, how to add a Redshift camera, how to use the Redshift render view to preview your scene, and how to apply certain Redshift settings so that you can get a cleaner or a clean final render. We're not going to be covering any of those topics, so if you need a refresher, I recommend that you visit the Redshift YouTube channel, where you'll find a lot of very good tutorials about these more basic topics. Again, we will not be getting too complicated here, but it just helps to know these basics before we jump into it. So let's go ahead and get this going. As you can see, we have our scene here, very basic, kind of like dinner table setting. We already have a Redshift camera set up. We already have a Redshift dome light using an HDRI to light our scene. So all we have to do is just add materials to these default flat gray objects so we can get some realism going. So let's go ahead and create some materials. I think we already know how to do this, but just to refresh your memory, we can go down here to our Create button in our material palette. Or we can equally go to our Redshift menu here and go down to Materials. Either way is fine. So we'll go ahead and go into the Redshift submenu and Materials, and you'll see that there's a long list of material types that you can use. We won't have the time to cover them all, but you can see that we have dedicated car paint, hair, skin, volume materials, incandescents, etc. However, we are going to stick to the most essential Redshift material, and it's the one that you'll be using 95% of the time, if not more, which is your standard RS material. Okay, and this is analogous to the standard PBR Uber shader that you see in many other shading systems. So it's the same concept, right? This will give you all of the base properties, and again, all I'm doing is clicking on my material, and it's showing up here in my attributes manager. But you have all these options or all these properties such as diffuse properties, reflection properties, refraction properties, subsurface or scattering properties, multiple subsurface scattering, coating, overall properties such as opacity, emission, etc., and some other more advanced features that we'll not be covering here. So again, let's go ahead and add this material to some of the objects in our scene. In this case, I want to start out with the knife and fork because I want to create a metallic material to apply to these. Now, in order to see these changes being reflected, you see that I added the material to these objects. I have to start my IPR. And you can see how quickly the IPR updates to show me that change. So let's go ahead and change this to a metallic material. I could do that manually, or I could go ahead and choose a preset from one of the many presets that Redshift offers within the RS material based properties. In this case, I know that I want something that kind of looks like platinum or silver, so I'll choose platinum. And I can see right away that this is looking pretty good. One thing that I might want to do is take the roughness of my reflections. And again, I'll just close a lot of these tabs so you can see, right? So you have the base properties being divided into diffuse, reflection, and refraction. So let's just open up the little reflection sub-tab here, and we'll just take down the roughness so we have some sharper reflections to make it look more like a polished platinum type of silverware set. This is great. Let's go ahead and create a material for our plate now. I'll create another Redshift RS material. I should probably rename these cutlery. And then I'll rename this to plate. And add the second material to my plate. And presuming that our plate is maybe like a ceramic material, there's not really a lot that we have to do here. Maybe just change the diffuse color to something brighter. Maybe just give it a little bit of an off-white tint. And maybe just add a little bit of roughness to our reflections. So it's a little less polished. But you can still see some sharpish reflections. So it looks like a clean plate either way. Okay, that's great. Let's just move on very quickly to our next object, which will be the candle. So we'll create another Redshift RS material. Call this candle. And apply it to our candle object here. If we want to get a candle like something more of a natural or raw wax candle, what we can do is change our diffuse color to something that's kind of like yellowish. Change our reflections to be a little rougher. And in this case, we may want to browse away briefly from the Base Properties tab and into our Multiple Subsurface Scattering tab. Subsurface Scattering, basically, as the name implies, simulates the scattering of light under the surface. So wax is one of those materials that does exhibit this kind of behavior where light moves under the surface. So in order to make this candle look more realistic and not just like a big solid hunk of plastic, we do want to add some subsurface scattering. So we'll go ahead and turn up the subsurface scattering amount. And you can see now that it's translucent. It's more translucent, which is again simulating light going through. However, this is a little too much because subsurface scattering is dependent on scale. So by default, the radius scale is set to 100, and our candle object is only 8 by 12 by 8 centimeters. So what we should probably do is take down this radius scale to something that makes sense. So how about we try 10, which is literally the number between 8 and 12. And voila, you can see now that this looks a lot more like wax. So again, there's some light going through, but you can still see the diffuse color properties of it. So it's a nice perfect balance between a nice solid object, but also an object that does allow some light going through it. So that's pretty wax-like. So I think we're pretty happy, and we can move on to the next. Next thing we'll take care of is our glass of wine and the wine inside of it. So we'll create 2 new Redshift RS materials. We'll call one of them wine, and we'll call the other one glass. So I'll make sure to apply the glass material to our glass, and we'll start out with that. So this is one of those cases where we can actually use one of the Redshift presets under the Base Properties tab. So I'll go ahead and choose the glass preset. And you can see how immediately now our IPR shows that our wine glass is made of glass. And this is great. As before, I'm going to just add a little bit of roughness to our reflection because in real life, there's no such thing as a perfectly smooth surface. It's a good thing to bear in mind whenever you're working with materials. Also, we don't really need to see the diffuse tab or sub-tab in this case because a glass is mainly just comprised of reflection and refraction. We don't really have to do a lot here, so I think we can just move on to the next object, which is our wine inside of the glass. So I'll go ahead and apply the wine material to our wine, and we will work on this. Let's actually make this one from scratch. So again, we know that like a refractive or transparent object doesn't really have any diffuse coloring, so we can turn down the weight of the diffuse color, and we can close that. Next, we'll look at reflections. Of course, yes, it is a liquid, so it is somewhat reflective, but we probably, again, want to turn up the roughness just a bit. And also, we want to think about the index of refraction. By default, it's set to 1.5, which is more like glass. We may want to take it down to like 1.3, which is closer to water. Okay, this is great, but right now it just looks like a more like ink, like a solid blob of ink in the glass. So let's look at refractions and transmission now. So the first thing we want to do, of course, is turn up the refraction weight. So now we have a transparent object. Now it's kind of getting lost in the glass now, but we'll take care of that momentarily. So the first thing that you may want to do is give your object or your refraction a little bit of some kind of like reddish tint. So that's one step. However, one other thing that you may want to do is give your materials a little bit of what's called absorption, because in real life, liquids, especially liquids that are not just water, and even water, have some level of absorption, meaning they eat up light as it goes through it. So right now it's like perfectly non-absorbent, so all light is going through it equally. You want to add some absorption, so as you know, depending on the angle that you look at it, light is absorbed and it'll just look a lot more real. So we'll go ahead and first of all give the absorption some kind of color again, maybe something like this, and then we'll take the absorption scale up until we reach a level that we're happy with. And I think this might be good. This is something that, again, we could continue to tweak endlessly, but we really kind of want to keep it simple and not spend a lot of time working on it. But right away you can see that it does look pretty close to wine. For the purposes of this, I think I'm happy with it, and I want to move on. The next thing I want to take care of is my table. So let's go ahead and instead of creating a Redshift RS material, I want to show how Redshift does, to an extent, take Cinema 4D native materials and translate them into something that can be read by Redshift and rendered out. So I'll go ahead. Let's say that I want to have more of a like a marble table. So I can go into my content browser here, and I had actually searched for this before. So I'll go ahead and this marble dandy material, I'll grab it and I'll drag it onto my tabletop. And again, this is a native Cinema 4D material. It has no relation to Redshift at all. However, Redshift is taking some of the information like the color, reflectance, and others, and translating it to the best of its abilities, so that you can, at the very least, like preview it, or if you need to, in a rush, render it out, you can, even if it's not the exact recommended workflow. So again, you can see that in this case, what's happening is in the color channel, I have a Cinema 4D layer shader using a variety of Cinema 4D noises with which Redshift again supports. It's just taking all of this information from that layer shader and these noise shaders and turning it into baked textures. So if I work on this, on these values a bit, just to bring in some of the darker elements here, because of the lighting, it was looking a little bit blown out and washed out, then you can see now how Redshift is taking this noise, all of these noise patterns in this layer shader, and actually turning them into something that Redshift can read. And of course, Redshift also obeys texture tags, so we could even change the mapping to something like cubic, and maybe change the scaling. And you can see that it's reflected in Redshift again. Again, you'll see some tiling, of course. This is to be expected. But again, depending on the size of your textures and other things, you can definitely make it fairly seamless. Again, this is not really the recommended way of working, though. I would always recommend to stick to using Redshift materials whenever possible. And one way of doing this, let's say that we have this Cinema 4D material, and I really do like this noise pattern that's giving me this kind of marble surface, and I want to use it within a Redshift material context. It's actually not very difficult. All I have to do is, first of all, I'll create a new RS material. And I'll apply it to my tabletop, and again we'll see that of course it's replaced the previous material, and now we're back to the default glossy gray. However, if I click on this new material, I'll call it tabletop, and I will go ahead and in the material properties, I want to click on this button that says Edit Shader Graph. I can see now that this launches a Redshift shader graph for this material, the tabletop, and you can see that it's a node-based system. One of the benefits to using a node-based system is that, well, you can more clearly see the relationship between what one node does to the other, and also you can have one node, for example, connected to multiple other nodes, which gives it a more procedural nature, and you can have changes being applied more automatically across the board, and this is going to save you a lot of time. And as you can see, it's also Espresso based. So if you're already familiar with Cinema 4D and you have used Espresso for anything before, you'll see that this is extremely familiar. And one benefit of that is also that you can combine it with Espresso nodes. So you could have something like a time node, completely Espresso based, and sending time information to some kind of change in the Redshift node system for some really interesting effects. So this is great, and this is going to save you a lot of time. It can seem a little intimidating at first, but after some time, it won't be. It'll actually make a lot more sense, and we'll see that it'll be a lot faster than working with channels. Anyways, what I want to do is I want to keep this shader graph open here for a second, and I'm going to click on my Cinema 4D material so that I can click and drag this texture onto my Redshift shader graph, and you can see by just clicking and dragging the texture, Redshift created the necessary nodes, right? So again, what's happening, Redshift is using this first node to bake the Cinema 4D layer shader into its own texturing language, let's just call it that. Then it's being sent to a Redshift texture node, which then parses all this information into color values, which can then in turn, if I click and drag here, again, this is a very familiar Espresso way of working, clicking and dragging from this output, I will drag it onto this little blue icon here, or the blue tab, until it turns green, and I let go, and then it'll show me the list of available inputs, and I'll go ahead and choose in my diffuse, the diffuse color. And again, you can see now that the shader color, or sorry, should I say the Cinema 4D layer shader color is being sent now into my diffuse color. And I can now continue to work completely in the Redshift shading system, taking advantage of all these other things that I wouldn't be able to if I just kept using the Cinema 4D native material. So I can go ahead actually and now delete the Cinema 4D material because I don't need it, and I can just keep working in this Redshift material system. And that's going to be great. It's going to be very advantageous. Okay. And of course, as before, the Cinema 4D, or should I say, sorry, the Redshift shader does obey the Cinema 4D texture tags. So again, I can change the mapping to cubic and change the scaling of my UVs. And there you go. Again, it looks a little tiled because this is simply just a texture that's being just tiled across the surface of this table. If I wanted to have something more seamless, one thing that I could do is actually use one of Redshift's built-in noises as opposed to the Cinema 4D noises. So I'll just quickly do this. I'll go ahead and delete the Cinema 4D layer shader and the texture shader. Again, we're back to our default. And in my Redshift node browser here, I could either look for a noise shader, or I can just type it in and then drag it and drop it into my graph. Of course, just dragging and dropping something into the graph doesn't really do much until you connect it to something. In this case, I'll connect the out color of my noise into the diffuse color of my material. And again, we have a black and white noise pattern. And of course, we can go into our noise now and play around with some of the parameters until we get a shader that we're happy with. And then, of course, go back to our RS material now. And in the base properties, maybe adjust the reflections so they're a little rougher. And because marble can be a little bit translucent, maybe we do want to add some subsurface scattering. Maybe, again, the default is a little too much, but if we go back to, say, 10, as we did before with our candle, this looks a lot more like real marble. And again, I believe that's all the time we have to go through this. But you can see how in a very short amount of time, we got to a point where we have some fairly realistic objects in a scene. In future tutorials, we'll go into more advanced ways of creating objects, or of creating materials to add to your objects, and getting some really interesting experimental and like grungy, more real materials. Right, so again, at least I hope that this quick introduction was somewhat helpful. Keep an eye out for more. In the meantime, enjoy learning Redshift.